The Biophilic Leadership Summit is the only multi-day conference entirely dedicated to biophilic projects, principles, and research, bringing together the top industry leaders in an intimate, natural setting to network, build partnerships, and learn from each other.
This year's summit will explore biophilic placemaking and how we can use biophilic principles to promote health, happiness, and vitality in public spaces.
In addition to fascinating presentations, delicious farm-to-table meals at Serenbe, and cocktails, this year's summit will feature a selection of biophilic experiences like forest bathing, bird watching, and more.
So join us in Serenbe for the 6th Annual Biophilic Leadership Summit from March 24th to March 26th, 2024.
Learn more about the summit and register today at biophilic.summit.com.
That's biophilic.summit.com. We hope to see you there.
Hi, I'm Monica Olson.
And I'm Jennifer Walsh.
And you're listening to the Biophilic Solutions Podcast, where every other week we sit down with experts and thought leaders across industries in order to explore the innate connection between humans and nature and why we need nature to thrive.
We truly believe that in order to tackle the global environmental problems we're facing, we as humans must reconnect to the natural world and come to a better understanding of how we fit in and how we are so interconnected. So in every episode, we'll interview new guests that help us uncover and highlight nature-based solutions to get us on a path to greater health, tackling climate change, and ultimately getting outside and connecting with nature.
So let's get to today's episode. Jen, anytime we talk about climate change, we like to think about it through the lens of hope and solutions. I mean, we have solutions in our name. So today's guest is Dr. Tim Lenton, and I wanted you to kind of give me a little bit of a deep dive on who he is.
Yeah, Tim was such an interesting guest. So Tim is the chair of climate change and Earth system science at the University of Exeter, and is the founder of the Global Systems Institute, which is a leading organization when it comes to understanding the global challenges we face and, crucially, how we might go about solving these challenges together.
Yeah, and really the cool thing that you're going to hear from him today is this concept of positive tipping points.
Which I loved, by the way.
So these positive tipping points, he's really become well known over the past few years for this idea. And so how do we look at certain climate solutions where we can stave off climate change's worst outcomes with a positive tipping point? He gives great examples in our conversation. And I also think, like, thinking about how social movements can also have a real impact, as well as individual actions, lower the carbon footprint. But I promise you, this is not your typical climate conversation.
Absolutely. So let's get to our conversation with Tim Lenton. Tim, thank you so much for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you a part of the Biophilic Solutions podcast.
Thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah, we are. Yeah. We have so much to ask you today. Monica and I have been talking about you a lot. So I know we're on limited time today. So we'd like to ask, as always, how did you get into your interest in earth science? And tell us a little about your background.
I was an 18-year-old kid who grew up loving nature and enjoying wild places and climbing mountains. And I was kind of struggling in my first term at Cambridge University when my dad gave me Jim Lovelock's books on Gaia for Christmas. And I had a kind of epiphany. I read the books on Gaia and I was just like, this guy's got it. This is bang on. This is dead right. This is what I want to work on. And so I was a bit depressed with my university at the time, I'll confess, and I wrote to Jim Lovelock saying, this is fantastic, this is what I want to research, because I knew I had the calling to be a scientist. I love to try and understand nature. And Jim kindly wrote back, and I met him the summer I turned 19, and we kind of became great friends, and many good things flowed from there.
That's amazing. So will you share with our audience Gaia and the Gaia hypothesis that he really popularized?
Yeah, so in a nutshell, it's kind of the idea that life on Earth has made the Earth better for itself in terms of completely transforming and regulating the composition of the atmosphere, also affecting the climate, cycling all of the elements we all need to thrive, because there are only meager inputs of all the essential elements, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and so on, coming in and out of volcanoes and tectonic processes, or occasionally arriving as meteorites from space. So the Earth system, the surface, the beautiful living system at the surface of the Earth, is this extraordinary recycling system in which myriad feedbacks involving life, but they generally tend to regulate things, spin round and amplify all the stuff that they need. And occasionally there are these tumultuous changes that I end up calling revolutions that kind of transform the system.
Right. And I think your current book that you're writing right now, I think you're still in process of that. Isn't that correct? You took some time off.
I am. I'm enjoying a hard-earned year of study leave to try to write about how we collectively as humans could get our act together, stop bringing about our own apocalypse, but rather instead create some kind of, well, what I would 10 years ago have framed as a kind of positive revolutionary change of the Earth system, where we become constructive, active participants in Earth system or Gaia, call it what you like, depending on your taste.
Sure. So did you decide to write this book because of everything you've studied thus far? Or was there like I know you always talk about tipping points. Was there something in particular that made you really want to dive into writing this book?
Oh, with the latest one, I've just kind of gone through that process many of us have of thinking, oh my word, what a mess we're collectively making of this beautiful life support system we've been kind of born or evolved into. And we're really running existential risks for our societies, if not for our living selves. But it's kind of disempowering at some level if all you do is stare at what I call the bad climate tipping points that we could trigger or may already be triggering. And seeing the world as a kind of living system includes humans and societies as an integral part of that. It does at least give me a view where I can see that we can also change ourselves and our societies and our technology, sometimes quite abruptly. And the same principles of complex systems are there in us and in all the network societies we have to be agents of positive change. We just need to think in the right way in terms of these complex systems and then act in the right way. So rather than depress everybody with yet another misery fest book about the climate ecological crisis, I prefer a narrative of like increasing jeopardy. So I'm afraid the first part of the book is going to up the ante, but then we're going to go past a pivot point in the narrative and we're going to cheer ourselves up and bring ourselves out the depths of despair with at least some, what my friend of mine calls plausible grounds for hope.
We are big fans of the hope and, hence the solutions and the title of the podcast. So I know that, a huge part of it is the group you've been working with here, which is really sort of the Global Systems Institute. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because is that who you're taking a break from right now? And then this will be sort of a book to push there, not that taking a break, but taking time off from, and you're sort of pushing that forward with this book and research that you're doing.
Yeah, so about 11 or 12 years ago, I moved to where I am now, the University of Exeter in Devon in England. And I came here because I saw the opportunity to try and start something, to kind of gestate an institute that would be orientated on transformative solutions and not just diagnosing the problem, although we have a foundation in the city of Exeter with the university and the UK's Met Office of great climate research and telling the world about the climate ecological crisis. But I wanted to try and gently take us in a new direction, and I've had a lot of fun trying to found that institute and help foster a community that sort of self-identifies with the task, and it's strong and it's grown. You should never leave leaders in the same job for too long. You should always refresh. So I took my own advice there, and also really want to take these messages that maybe we've been gestating with the community here in Exeter and international colleagues out to a wider audience. And to do that, I certainly find you have to take the space and get into the mind of a different audience.
I really love that, Tim. That's interesting. You're saying a gestation period of kind of stepping back a little bit and listening, like really cueing into the world around you to listen to the fear, the mongering, the doom cycle, as we always talk about. Monica goes for the doom cycle. But I love the fact of this idea of the positive tipping points, like these things, this notion that we can come out more understanding and more knowledgeable. Can you talk a little bit more about the idea of positive tipping points?
Yeah, sure, Jennifer. I mean, tipping points in general, for me, refer to, well, what Malcolm Gladwell in his famous book called Where a Small Change Makes a Big Difference. So then you ask yourself, well, how can a small change turn into a big difference? Well, it can do that when you have a situation within a system of what we'd call strong reinforcing or amplifying or positive feedback, where a little change in a system generates a sort of causal chain of reactions that feed back on and amplify that initial change. And they do so strongly enough that you go around the feedback loop another time and you get just as much change again and again and again. Now, that's a pretty special and somewhat rare situation where the amplifying feedbacks in a system get strong enough to become self-propelling. But when you do, that's kind of the definition of a tipping point, because you could take away any factors that were like driving a system in a particular direction, and at that point it'll just carry on under its own steam. Well, of course, that's a big worry in the climate. If you start triggering tipping points like the irreversible self-propelling melt of ice sheets or changes in the ocean circulation or the atmospheric circulation, I've been quietly or not so quietly telling the world about those for about 15 years. And unfortunately, the world is showing us, unfortunately, examples of them. But at the same time, it's manifestly clear to me, and I'm sure to everybody, that sometimes human societies change abruptly and irreversibly through these kind of self-propelling changes. And I could cite many examples, starting with maybe social movements, protest movements and political movements. Like one of my distant relatives was one of the famous suffragettes, Lenton, who I took a lot of inspiration from that movement and her as an individual. But there's a whole series historically of political movements that Erica Chenoweth and others have shown you only need 3.5% active participation in a non-violent social movement for all of those ones to have succeeded, and many succeeded with less. So that's our kind of tipping point change in society. But another crucial one is we sometimes can abruptly change technology and our relationship with it. And when it comes to solving the climate and ecological crisis, it's all about changing the activities that either emit the greenhouse gases or cause the habitat destruction or whatever. And when you get down to that, well, that's about changing technology as well as about changing society. So it's all about hunting down these strong reinforcing feedbacks. And in technology, we have names for them. We talk about learning by doing, making a technology better as you make more of it, or economies of scale. The more we make something, the cheaper it gets to make, and so on and so forth. Turns out those reinforcing feedbacks can get so strong that in general they can become strong enough that a new technology can reach a tipping point where then it's going to diffuse, as they call it, throughout society. And that's exactly what we're beginning to see and what we need to see more of for renewable energy and a bunch of other things.
Can you share some real world examples of positive tipping points that are happening or have happened?
Yeah, so the parochial one from the UK in the climate domain is that 2012, 40% of our power, like electricity, was from coal burning. As of now, within a decade, it dropped to less than 2% or less than 1%. And that was triggered actually by a modest price on carbon just in the power sector, for carbon emissions, a floor price as it's called, that was just stepped up until it was stepped up enough to tip the economics away from coal burning. At the same time, against a backdrop of exponential expansion of renewable energy, such that although it looked like gas burning was just substituting for coal, in fact, all the numbers show that it's renewables that are now giving us at least 40% of our electricity in the UK, and are on an exponential growth curve, with offshore wind being the big thing where I am. So that's one example. Another that's also kind of consumer-related technology switch is to electric vehicles in Norway. In just the last decade, they've gone from in 2010, they're about 0.5% market share. They're now at 83 or 84% market share for battery electric vehicles. And there's a brilliant story involving social activists starting it behind why Norway first? Why Norway? But yeah, the good news is in both these cases of renewable energy and electrification of personal mobility or transport, those tipping points are spreading to other countries and ultimately to become global tipping points. So I can give you a few more facts and figures if you want, but we're really seeing
we'd love that.
Exponential growth of solar power and wind power globally, a doubling time for installed, say, solar power globally of about, I think it's about every 3 years at the moment, the installed capacity is doubling. Could be less, actually. I'll check my own numbers. But when you're on exponential growth, as we all learned bitterly in the pandemic, you can really get surprised by the rate of change. And with the electric vehicle fleet, if you like, globally, I think that, if memory serves, that's doubling in size every year and a half at the moment. So, and we see in my group, we've been analysing the data, we see strong evidence that we've passed the tipping point for the decline of petrol and diesel cars in several major economies. US is lagging a bit behind, but it might have gone already. China's certainly gone, and there are a bunch of European countries that are already past the tipping point, and the transformation, like in Norway, is unfolding. And then it all becomes about, okay, well, what other smart things could either politicians and policymakers do, or we as consumers or other actors like the media do, to make these positive tipping points happen sooner and faster?
Right.
And yeah, we can talk about that. Already we begin to learn a bunch of things we could do. And crucially, with tipping points, the great news is we don't have to get everybody to agree on everything before radical change happens. That's been what's held us back with the climate crisis. We've had this, I would say, somewhat crazy expectation in the United Nations and international negotiations that we were going to get unilateral agreement on unilateral action. Well, it doesn't have to unfold like that, because if enough actors or countries with a shared interest, for example, in renewable energy happening sooner and faster, acts in a coordinated way together, you might only need, 20% of the world population representation or something to tip for everybody else to follow. It depends a bit on the context, but that's the case clearly with renewables to tip the global market and electric vehicles to tip the global market.
And it sounds like, or if I recall reading about Norway, that it wasn't just people just changed their behavior. It was that there were environmental policies, there were corporate policies. I believe they even made, if you had an EV, the parking was free within the cities. Like a sort of interesting, to your point, small things that changed people's behaviors. I think about a lot about these big cities, and I think London has done this, maybe New York, Jen. I think San Francisco is considering it, is the fees to drive into the city, right? I'm not sure what they're called, but that obviously disincentivizes cars coming into the city, and we can sort of start to take back our streets for pedestrians and bikers.
Precisely. You're dead right in citing those examples. And the Norway case study is just really rich because it actually begins in the late 1980s with the Morten Harket, the lead singer of the pop band a-ha, a friend of his, an architect called Harald Rostvik, an environmentally orientated, or biophilic, if you like, architect, and an environmentalist, Frederick Haug. Now, at the time, Norway was governed by Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland. She's famous for the Brundtland Commission that gave the world the concept of sustainable development. And yes, at the time in Norway, their policies were increasing oil and gas extraction from the North Sea and exporting even more of it onto the global market. So these true environmentalists got together and said, well, that's hypocrisy. We want to call their bluff. So we're going to say, we've got a plan. We're going to come up with 8 policy demands that would incentivize electric vehicle transition in Norway, because in Norway it was already 96% renewable electricity from hydropower, very cheap electricity, and a strong electric network, so you had the potential to charge at home. They come up with all these demands. They knew the media were following Aha, the band, everywhere they went in the late 1980s. So they went to Switzerland to the annual solar car electric vehicle races. They drew attention to their plan because the media was with them. The next year, they imported a hobby converted electric vehicle to Norway, demanding that the import registration tax, which was really hefty in Norway, would be waived for that car and every EV thereafter. And they kind of got their wish there. They didn't get their wish or request for road tolls to be waived for EVs, but they proceeded to drive the car through the toll bar tolls, not pay, park it illegally, not pay. The car got impounded by the authorities, but a friend they didn't know bought it back, gave it back to them. They repeated the cycle. Anyway, about 7 years later, the government starts coming round. It caves into the demand for remove road tolls for EVs and some of the other demands. And then the social activists and the governance start to align and coordinate, if you like. And then, as you say, they implement a load of progressive initiatives that tax or they're foregone revenue for the government. They're like reducing taxes for EVs and incentivizing them other ways that basically make it more attractive for the consumer there to make the switch as soon as basically some major manufacturers start putting EVs on the market around 2011. Bam, you just see just the tips and it just takes off from there. So yeah, a fascinating story of like in Gaia or the Earth system, you have this sort of interplay between processes coming from the bottom up, like life innovates, and people start social movements and they try to create political change. And then there are these sort of governing conditions from the top down, well, kind of politics in society, a little bit different in the Earth system. But somehow if the two in the social system, if the two can get in alignment, then bam, you can get a great example of change.
It's so interesting. And this might be a different conversation or off the cuff, but I'm interested to see if you're hearing this as well, because when you're talking about this whole congestion pricing that they're calling it in New York City, where I live, and this education. So I'm not sure. This is what the conversations I'm hearing in New York City. So I'm not sure if you're hearing them as well where you are, but the idea of also educating people, that's not just better for the environment, but also for sound. So think about the noise implications and human health. So are you hearing people having conversations, not just one thing, but overall, like the health implications and how much better it is for us for sound even alone, and how those impact our daily lives? It'd be so much quieter and better for us to not have that noise pollution.
Yeah, I mean, London has been a really interesting case in point. There's ongoing political movement, shall we say, and squabbling over extending the zero emission vehicle zone, I think they call it, outwards into Greater London and the suburbs. But in the centre of London, there's been a whole lot of active discussion about how much nicer a place to be it is now. It's not that it's completely devoid of traffic, but it's like a sea change. And it's not a perfect example, but there's a measurable, I mean, quantitative shift towards what academics call multimodal transport, which is a kind of mishmash term for the fact that people are cycling more. There's some of the cycling infrastructure is starting to come in. People are walking more. The buses are cleaner and better. There's been a distinct and constructive shift kind of away from the car, as well as the quietening and all these other and cleaner air benefits. So yeah, it's then you get into the realm of, it can be something we call social contagion, when it's kind of like we're changing our behaviors and our norms influenced by the conversations we're having and the experiences we're seeing of other people around us. There's a whole lot of that going on in these transitions, and it's certainly manifested in Norway with their electric vehicle revolution, because one of the great policies was to allow electric vehicles into bus lanes, and that meant, for example, in Oslo, that people with an EV could get their kids to school in the morning and get to work in like half the time of anybody else, and they start talking about this, and everybody else is like, I want one of those, I need one of those, because surprise, surprise, we value our time at a very high level, as we should.
Absolutely.
Do you have any social movements or activist groups that you're sort of admiring or watching to see if they're getting close to a tipping point?
I certainly admire them in the green space. I mean, they're never perfect, but I have broad admiration, and I often get invited to speak to kind of bottom-up social movements. They could be pretty much every sizable town where I live has its own grassroots green group, whether that's an official transition town movement group or they've given themselves another label. But I'll always go make the time to go and interact with and speak with those groups, because I believe the change we need, a lot of it is coming from the bottom up, and it just needs those bottom-up initiatives to network together more effectively and learn from each other's successes and failures. And then we're in business. And we see that through networks like the Transition Town Movement or C40 Cities or whatever. These are all connecting up bottom-up initiatives. I mean, metaphorically, I see it as like how bacteria have basically been running the planet for 4 billion years. The little innovations happen in some little invisible bacterium somewhere, but they can spread quite fast because they can exchange genes horizontally, et cetera, et cetera. But they basically... microbes are like these little actors that network together in very effective ways, but humans can be like that as well. So yeah, I admire those humans that are making that kind of change happen from the bottom up. I'm also fascinated by the fact that some of the climate movement has taken on board tipping point principles quite explicitly. So in Extinction Rebellion, that started out of the UK, had read the literature on how that looking across something like 300 social movements, as 3.5% active participation from the population in a non-violent protest movement as a rule was sufficient for that movement to achieve the change it wanted to. And that cuts across from the suffragettes to gay marriage and a bunch of other brilliant and fascinating cases, the Black Civil Rights Movement in the US, so on and so forth. Extinction Rebellion read their stuff and then thought, right, let's design a strategy to create change based on this empirical evidence. We're going to try to mobilize the active participation of 3.5% of the population. Ergo, we should then start to get the change we need. Great. So I'm super fascinated in this because for me, it's people who are already trying to think in terms of positive tipping points and put what we know into practice. And yeah, of course, there's many dissenting voices and possibly listeners who are like, God, these troublemaking protesters or whatever. But you kind of need to see that in a historical context. You need to remember that my relative Lillian Lenton in 1913 is setting fire to buildings, and once she's made sure there's nobody in them, to just, as she put it, her phrase was something like, it wanted to create an intolerable political situation in the country, this was the UK at the time, where it became apparent that you could not govern without the consent of the governed, the citizens. You know, and this was the core principle in the suffragette movement. And in my word, it worked.
No, and I think I love that you brought up Extinction Rebellion, because that's something that I've been following since their inception. And I do think that what they've done, I feel like they took over, was it the London Bridge? You know, like the very dynamic, very public, very peaceful, but at the same time disruptive. Very interesting, because we have to call attention to these things. And so I'll just say that. But as I'm saying that, I'm sort of thinking, you know, in the news lately, right, we've got these crazy heat waves all over the world. We have these terrible, terrible fires that are, you know, out of control all over the world. And obviously in the US, in Maui most recently. And so now we have these, if you will, these very disruptive climate disasters that are happening versus activists creating disruption on, say, the London Bridge. Where do you think that's going to take us? Because the headlines are obviously calling it out. They're calling it climate disasters. I'm even starting to hear language, climate hurricanes, climate floods. You know, I think it's an interesting language shift, but I'm not hearing solutions. You know, I'm not, I'm just hearing it's happening. And I'm like, well, very good. What are our solutions? Where are our tipping points?
Precisely. I think we can all agree with, whether we liked it or not, and most people probably don't, we've entered into turbulent times where the pandemic was a pretty striking kind of crossover between the biosphere and the human sphere that shocked the system, for sure. But we're now seeing these off the scale climate extremes. We could cite a whole bunch of other things in the last 10, 20 years that show that we're heading into this volatile situation. And when the biosphere or the natural system starts to show signs of tipping, any complex system that's tipping, you'll see increased variability beforehand as a kind of signal. and you'll see the system struggle to recover from shocks. And we're beginning to see that manifest tragically in the biosphere and in the climate system. And you're right, at the same time, it's destabilizing our social foundations. We've realized we've really messed up here. The climate is out of whack, as my dear departed friend Bruno Latour would have described it. And it clearly was regulating, because otherwise we wouldn't be so exercised by the fact that we've knocked it out of whack. And now, yes, we do have some social actors that appear to be just causing further disruption, and no doubt for many ordinary citizens that's just another annoyance. And that's but the crucial message is we're going to get transformative change one way or the other. There is no other option left. We're either going to have kind of transformative and potentially catastrophic change if we just plod, if we just stick to the way we've been doing things. The Earth is showing us that bad stuff is going to go down, and it's going to go down in a kind of non-linearly increasing way according to the current evidence. None of us should want to enter into that future world, but we left it too late to incrementally avoid the big threats from climate change and nature loss. We've been sat on our hands for the 50 years I've been alive, essentially doing very little. So now the only option is transformative change. It kind of bottoms out at basically changing most of our actions with respect to the system, our life support system, and accelerating the way we change them as fast as we can. You could say, I don't like that. I don't like the thought that most people don't. Most people don't like change. They're like, I don't want change, but I'm afraid we're left with the choice, which kind of change do you want? Because that's the corner we've painted ourselves into. And that's why I'm kind of passionate about, okay, let's embrace the positive change where we get ourselves out of the worst of the bad things that might otherwise unfold. And by the way, we made a cleaner, healthier, more flourishing place for us, our kids, our grandkids, and all the generations to come to kind of continue the human journey, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. Well, Tim, I think that's fascinating. And Monica, I'm glad you kind of brought that up, because I also love the fact that you talk about the bacteria. Because I always think of all of us are like mycelium. We're like those little things under our feet, and we're all connected to try and create a better world for us all and healthier. But so how do we as regular people, or how do everyday people come together? And what are some practical actions that each of us could take to kind of make a difference going forward for that tipping point?
Great question. I think we can answer it at different levels. We can definitely answer, well, what can we do just as an individual? But then there's that question of, okay, how can we network together more effectively to be part of change? So as individuals, clearly we can choose or not to change our behaviors and our consumption patterns. And it's pretty easy these days to work out your own carbon or ecological footprint and work out where the big hits are coming from in that. If you fly still, that'll be one of the big hits in your carbon footprint, typically. But so will if eating meat, if you eat a lot of meat. I'm not saying necessarily black and white stop, but reducing meat consumption, that's typically for most relatively rich Westerners high up on the list of the things that are driving their ecological and carbon footprints. And then cars are usually fairly high up there. So I'm making a guess on the audience listening here, but we can all work those things out. But then there's like, where's my pension invested? Something most of us don't maybe spend a lot of time thinking about, but if we find out something about it, we might be in for a nasty shock, because although this information isn't so transparent as it should be, I'm afraid for a lot of us, our pension may still be invested in fossil fuel extraction. It may still be invested in rainforest destruction through sort of circuitous routes. And if so, we might want to kind of make our voice heard on that. So that's coming out of the individual level. And then we get to, well, we're not alone, are we? I mean, so we've got some agency as consumers. Clearly we could, as I've hinted, we can choose to consume differently. And we've got some capital, like our pension, and we can choose to move capital around. And that's a pretty effective agent of change. And then there's the whole business of, do we want to start to club together with friends or make some new friends in, wanting to do things differently? Maybe in my case, I will be honest and say I grew up in the 1980s, and I was deeply disillusioned by this shift to a kind of consumerist culture that I found kind of empty, basically. And I sought solace in not in flying around the world to see the most beautiful places or whatever, although we've all done a bit of that. I just would go to the natural wild places I could find nearby, because I needed to be able to access that space for me regularly. It had to be a part of my life to contact nature in simple language. And I'm still exactly like that now. I live close to Dartmoor, Britain's first national park, and it is my place of solace or comfort to connect with wild nature, such as it is, in a obviously also human altered landscape. For what it's worth, I find that more empowering and nourishing than going shopping, which I love.
Same, Tim. We're speaking our language here, that's for sure.
So, but I don't just do it alone. I mean, like every activity, you find friends who actually share values and beliefs, and then together and networking to other self-organized groups in other parts of the neighborhood or the wider world, suddenly you start realizing, oh, we can join up on this, and we can start to create change. And that's for me that's a really exciting kind of change, especially if governance, for all its faults, starts to align or come on board with the change. Then we're really getting somewhere. But I even see that kind of in a broader way. I mean, if we just sit around waiting for our government, our elected government, to make the change we think ought to happen, then we're still going to be sitting here when the house is on fire, basically. But we lived through an era, or I have, where government ceded power to finance anyway, and markets and businesses and companies. So there's different kind of policy making. I'm not sure they'd call it that, but from coming out of or action at least coming out of every business, and the finance sector in particular has enormous leverage because it's kind of investing in all the other businesses. So if it starts changing its stripes or its focus, which there are signs it is, then my word, we're on to something. So I spend quite a bit of time hanging out with and trying to share this way of thinking with and make friends with people. Possibly some would say befriending the enemy, but make friends with people who are kind of there in the City of London or whatever, right there in the financial system.
I think we talk about how money drives so much, and we are always trying to inure a sense of wonder and awe with nature and encourage people to get outside. But so much of that, like in your case, starts as a child, but money, follow the money. Where is it? And can we start putting pressure? And when they do start, whether ESG is doing anything or not, at least there is starting to be a system that we're analyzing finances in a different way. And I think that will continue to get more rigorous.
It's like I feel like we created and are complicit in this economic and financial system. We may not like it. We might be idealists and say, I wish let's overturn neoliberal capitalism or whatever tomorrow. But practically, you're like, yeah, well, actually, maybe as Donella Meadows taught us, if you want to create change, you've got to understand the different leverage points. And you don't necessarily launch in trying to change the paradigm, because as she taught us, like decades ago, that's actually, although it's really powerful if you can, it's the hardest thing to change. So why not start working somewhere in the middle of the lever? And that's where my positive tipping point's coming from. Let's work with the feedbacks in the system. Let's work with the system from where it's at. Hopefully we're going to kind of ultimately fundamentally change the system, but we're not going to come in right on the front of the tin and try and overthrow
and suddenly be a fully cooperative socialist environment. So tell us, when is the book hoping to come out? Or maybe the better question is, when is your goal to maybe turn it in?
Well, I'm going to try and finish by the end of this calendar year. I can tell you I'm also working with over 200 or 300 colleagues on a global tipping points report to launch at COP28 in December, which is different to the book. It's got but I hope will help convey some of this thinking. If I turn the book in by the end of the year, I'm not sure how quick the publisher is. I'm not quite sure they're going to. I think I'll still be working with the editor by the time we get to next summer, but I'd hope that we might be able to get it out before the end of the 2024. So let's see. But yeah, it's not just that one book. As I said, I think the report, we also held a conference on this to sort of try and promote this thinking last year, and we'll hold another one next summer 2024 here in Exeter in the UK. So
Wonderful.
we're going to try diverse lines of attack to keep getting the message out there, just like the bacteria, right? Because you listen to the biosphere, you kind of need diverse strategies because you're never sure which one's going to stick. So try a few and let selection happen and see which strategy works.
Well, where can we follow you? How can we support you? You know, obviously we're going to share this out and get everybody to start waiting for the report and the book. But how can we help you now?
Well, that's a kind offer. I think I should probably offer up some of the links to our websites and so on where we're sharing this material. In a broader sense, I feel like, as our discussion has shown, we can always do better in like coordinating, sharing a common thinking. And I'm not sure I want to place the responsibility on you because it's perhaps a collective one. I feel like collectively, many of us in initiatives want to network more together. We might come up with a common kind of reading list or ground zero of the kind of thinking we need. But in my ideal world, we'd also have a meta initiative where all the islands of good activities singing on the same hymn sheet would be sharing their learning and experience, their practical experience. You know, I'm trying to make this community or this ecosystem better. I'm not pretending I've completely worked out the form this takes, but one of my friends explained it as like a sort of Wikipedia model. We need a sort of wiki model, but of the learning of the great biophilic transformation to sustainability.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm just putting that thought out there for would-be funders or whatever, because with the resource, you'd set up a model like Wiki for promulgating this knowledge and exchanging it.
Beautiful. Yeah, no, I think, maybe like Paul Hawkins Drawdown is one example of sort of pulling together these ideas. Yeah. But to your point, there are so many groups,
Exactly. So I sort of take the view as you don't want to be looking as if there's going to be one figurehead owning this, although good leadership is always welcome. It's like this distributed intelligence, like in the biosphere. And so it's about using technology and the stuff we have to facilitate a kind of distributed intelligence on solving our way out of the climate ecological crisis into a better future. That's the kind of, it's a bit academic, but it's a practical thought as well.
No, I like it. We'll noodle on that and know that we're all part of it. Yeah. Well, we always talk about we're all part of the biophilic movement. And there's no membership. Maybe there should be. There's no badge. It's like we're all humans and we're all part of it. So how do we collectively find the positive tipping point?
And I sometimes think, well, okay, right, there isn't currently a membership in a badge, but actually there is sometimes when a support group or a membership or a badge does emerge, it can actually help really reinforce the change that wants to happen, at least within the narrow confines of like particular technologies or things. Like in Norway, if you owned an EV, you were given a membership to the EV Owners Club. I mean, that's a narrow example. But if you think about the biophilia movement, maybe we need a badge. Yeah, arguably all I'm saying here is maybe we will benefit from being slightly better organized, but in a different kind of way. But if you have a badge or a shared identity, then it's a flag to gather around or whatever metaphor you want. And many people, I think, are pushing in this direction and they've given it different names, and that's exciting in itself. Yeah. But if we could come together on a common brand or name, brilliant, because I think loads of us would then self-identify with the movement, which is cool.
Good. Absolutely. Well, we're going to get your address and send you one of our hats at least. You have that.
Okay. Yes. We will give you that. Tim, thank you so much. Yeah, this has been delightful.
This was lovely. I know you've got 3 minutes to your next call. But this was a joy. And I don't know if you do get on a plane or maybe a ship and come see us if you're ever in the States.
Thanks so much. Well, I confess, although having not flown for 3 or 4 years, I will be coming to New York Climate Week in September.
Oh, fantastic.
So maybe we can connect there. Yeah.
Would love that. Jen. Would love that. I'm there. I'm here. So I would love to see you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. All right, Jen, that was a really compelling interview. I absolutely adored him, and I kind of have a crush just on his accent.
How can you not? How can you not? He's such a sweet guy, but so thoughtful in his delivery about why he believes what he believes in. And I really love his outlook on how we can have positive tipping points and conversations around climate. It doesn't have to be the doom and gloom that is so much a part of our news cycle. So I really appreciate this conversation with him today.
Yeah, and I really liked that 3.5% number that he referenced a few times. You know, how we can have this statistical tipping point. It really doesn't take a massive number of people to create this critical mass. So I think that if we can get that small percentage to start demanding change or making change, whether that's how we spend money or just sort of a mindset. I mean, we always talk about how can we build a biophilic movement. So maybe it's easier than we set out and think.
Absolutely. And just small notions and motions really can make impacts, not just for yourself, but your family and your community. So I think everyone has a role to play, and also to share these messages, which is why we have these conversations, to make that biophilic movement for everybody.
Yeah. And I think it sounds like his report that's coming out with the United Nations, he's got a book coming out in the next year. How can we sort of follow him, support him, and share his work? And I think that's going to be the greatest opportunity for all of us.
I agree. So we've got all the notes in our show notes. So you could go ahead and look him up and follow him and support. And Monica, till next time.
Till next time. Bye, Jen.
Bye, Monica.
Thanks so much for listening. And if you're enjoying the podcast, we would love for you to follow us on your favorite podcast app, give us a 5-star rating, and please leave us a review.
It really goes such a long way towards helping us reach a wider audience and sharing these amazing interviews and solutions with the world.
Absolutely. So thanks so much for following and reviewing the podcast, and we'll be back with another amazing interview in 2 weeks. You're now a part of the Biophilic movement.